That's right folks, we got sky pirates, haunted factories, heroes, villains and floating cities. Let's talk about Mileships. Ahoy there mateys, and welcome to the Archipelago, a huge mass of floating islands that hover over the world of the past, providing resources and shelter for thousands, all kept supplied using Mileships. What are Mileships, you ask? That is what we are here to discover as we explore Ian McQue's fantastical narrative art book of the same name. Working with author and game designer Jim Rossignol, McQue has built a setting where boats can fly, islands float, and the very shape of the world was changed overnight. Mileships is a series of artworks, journal entries, newspaper clippings and literature references that bring to life this world of sky pirates, merchants, engineers, corporations and mysterious creatures. And if that sounds interesting to you, then by Jove, let us waste no more time in the clumsy embrace of the ground. It's time to cast off and weigh anchor, comrades. We're off to the clouds. The key thing to understand about the world of Mileships is that at some point the rules fundamentally changed and lifted entire chunks of the planet's crust into the air, creating what came to be known as the Archipelago, a huge floating mass of levitating stones that exist now amongst the clouds. The materials providing this lift seem to be naturally forming salts and something else referred to as antimetals, and in the time since the Great Upheaval, humanity has managed to harness these resources to create the titular Mileships, boats that are able to fly amongst the archipelago and create a new way of life a mile up from the broken and enshadowed surface. Life continues on the surface, though the presence of so much salt working its way up out of the ground has created a vast saltwater swamp, a place where traditional crops struggle to survive and where life has had to adapt to a brackish existence. A consequence of a permanent barrier in the sky is that much of the stilt marsh landscape is swathed in gloom during the height of the day, a curtailment which insists to make crop growing difficult, limiting such industry to plants that can survive in brackish waters. Crucially, much of the output of this region is focused on the shellfish, eel and kelp farms which centre around the stilt communities. The double tide produced by the archipelago has inspired the denominative vernacular of the region, in which most permanent structures are hoisted on stilts up to 17 yards above the bed. It is by this conceit that the farmers are able to tend their harvest throughout the year, even when the tides are highest. The two-tier geography of this world has also led to a two-tier culture, with those that remained behind on the surface referred to as marshfolk and silt walkers, and those that left for the skies being known as skyborn. And there is something of an enmity between them, based on their different experiences and perspectives. It is fair to say that the skyborn literally look down upon these people, but it is primitive and ignorant to do so, for the marshfolk have a complicated culture which is born of hardship and speaks of another time before mankind climbed into the sky. These people are simple farmers and stilt house builders, true, but their kind has done far more than eke out crabs and razor clams for the people who live over their heads. Without such people, the world we have made now would be a weaker and more chaotic one. Without such will to live, the stones would not be the thriving world on which we perch, a pack of proud birds dependent on the actions of the creatures of the forest floor. Where life in the marshes is hard and somewhat less glamorous than it is for their airborne cousins, the Mileships offer something more optimistic and mysterious, an opportunity to find your fortune amongst the clouds, with people aspiring to run their own ships and explore the many unclaimed floating stones, and forge their own path. Where the marshfolk live in tall stilt-based houses and amongst huge smokestack buildings, the skyborn tend to live on their vessels, on huge floating townships, or on the stones themselves, depending on their means and resources, and each offers a very different experience. Throughout Mileships, we learn about these different lives via journals, articles and excerpts, and one of the great townships we learn of is Thunderhead, a legendary floating city built amongst the bones of an old derelict ship. Life there is cheap and cutthroat, bustling with stories of opportunity, of exploitation and of hardship, as its residents mix with the transient traders and crews of the constant flow of ships, feeling very much like one of Earth's own port towns in 17th or 18th century Western Europe, a place of stories, exaggeration and myth. Thunderhead teems with the archipelago. It is all of it shoved eagerly into a confined space. The people of the sky throng in the plazas and buy fireworks from the Sparkler de Pioneer. They eat goat flesh on the Great Circuit and rent a bunk at Cathar's Nightwist. Locals seal up their homes in case of burglary, and the magnates rent entire blocks to serve as a home whilst they grasp at the levers of industry. To live in Thunderhead means scratching some good luck charm words into the paving plates before you go out each morning. To visit Thunderhead means to know when you are leaving. The people who run this city in the stones often talk about how long it can last, and few of them suppose it is forever. Mythology and superstition make up a large part of the culture of the archipelago, helped along by the fact that the floating stones themselves can move around, changing position and making navigation an art as much as a science. Indeed, the adventurous cell of the Mileship life is a big part of its draw, despite the many dangers and challenges that face those willing to travel the skies. Whatever planetary process came to leave the archipelago of stones coiled halfway around the sky has created a dangerous, complex wilderness of minerals and salts for the keen and the hungry to exploit. Prospector ships are often fast cutters and converted keelboats that are sturdy enough to cover long distances and to descend into uncharted volumes where a stray stone might make for lethal unpleasantness on a more fragile vessel. Every few seasons, company agents will attempt to rein in these frontier impulses and to impose some sort of regulation or even a semblance of order upon the prospector clans. But such tape and record makes up a doomed enterprise. Surely many claims are lost and even deliberately hidden, but says the prospector, miles still spring up, and the salt continues to flow, and the Mileships, they continue to fly. As can be gathered from that last quote, there are some interesting dynamics amongst the Skyborn, with a mixture of huge companies and smaller independent vessels vying for their own slice of the economic pie. So let's take a look at some of the recurring characters we see and explore what they represent in Mileship's wider world. Mersed is a word that carries weight all throughout the archipelago, but Mersed is more than just a word or even just a name. It is a dynasty. It is an economic, military and political powerhouse and represents the established might of hereditary wealth. The Mersed Company have their fingers in pretty much every aspect of life on, above and below the archipelago, and are one of the main parties struggling for total control of all economic activity. Shipbuilders, mine owners, enforcers, water distributors, there is little that escapes their notice or their interest. Water lifters are among the heaviest of the Mileships, and although they have the smallest crew and often go ignored when seen next to more glamorous vessels, they are vital to the workings of all of the major settlements, for whom condensation traps and standing water from the stones is unavailable as a source of moisture. The Mersed Heavy Lifter, an ancient floating crane that acts as the main water column mechanism for the most heavily colonised central stones, is the largest Mileship at work in the core regions and has a long and storied history. The lifter has been under the control of the Mersed family for 5 generations, and a number of economists credit it with the outsized influence that the Mersed scions have been able to wield over the archipelago in recent decades. The Mersed family have identified and co-opted as many sought-after resources as possible and involved themselves in any interest that may shift the power dynamics of the archipelago. What they can't directly control, they influence, and every element in their supply chain is examined, as identified in this excerpt from the private diary of Foreman Tulaga. A gentleman named Mr. Mersed came by the mine today. He'd come to assess its problems in person, the foreman said. Mr. Mersed is some sort of Mileship builder, but he is concerned with the production in the mine because that's what his ships depend on. He has money on the table, the man in the rat and rudder says. Merst appears to represent the old-style capitalist dynasty that one would normally expect of a 19th century colonialist, complete with pocket watch and cane, and they wield a power not entirely unlike those associated with the East India Trading Company and the like. There are repeated mentions of conflict between unions and Merst's own forces, and we understand that in the absence of larger states, there is not much that can be done to hold Merst to account, as per this from the Thunderhead Journal. Shipbuilders throughout the archipelago have found their plans for collective action stymied by the swift action of Edwin Merst and his experienced team of strikebreakers. Merst strikebreaker teams have reportedly been seen equipping boarding batons and other weighted non-lethal equipment to remove Union members from contested buildings and anchored vessels in the Flagstone area. One man is reported to have been injured with a harpoon. The Merst dynasty are one of, if not the biggest power in the archipelago, and are determined to control as much of life there as they are able to, and they are not squeamish about using violence to do so, whether in utilising their fleet of warships, their strikebreakers, or through political influence and bribery. Aldous Kemplin is another big player in the archipelago, though his approach to dominance is somewhat different to that of the Merst family. Whilst hardly humble, Kemplin's rise to power at least appears to have had a more upward trajectory than the straightforward inheritance of power experienced by Edwin Merst, though Kemplin hardly came from nothing either. If Merst is predominantly concerned with the acquisition and maintenance of power, Kemplin is more focused on reputation and legacy. He cares what people think, whereas the current head of the Merst family doesn't seem to at all. Throughout the book, we see many excerpts from Kemplin's own hand as he attempts to create his own narrative on the archipelago, taking every opportunity to increase his own importance, to diminish the influence of others, and to basically humble brag about how smart or worldly he is. And he humble brags a lot. In his own writings, he makes concerted efforts to imply humility, but it does not take long to understand how much he enjoys hearing himself speak, and his actions tell us more than his conceited philosophizing, as per this from author Jarlin Kesselwaite. Aldous Kemplin, Mr. Kemplin to you and I, is a name that many people in this archipelago know well, but it is a name that chills those who have become personally familiar with its owner. Kemplin's hold over Mileship production is ruthless, commanding as he does so many of the aspects of technology that keep the great ships aloft. His rivalry with the designers and shipwrights at Thunderhead and Flagstone is quiet, but creeping, pernicious and constant. Officially, he does all of his work via his lawyers, but unofficially, a team of saboteurs, spies and thieves claim what Mr. Kemplin believes rightfully his, including his reputation. What he cannot control, he dismantles. The Cloud Yards themselves have become a tough place to work, with Kemplin's overseers taught to quote his writing when questioned, and to refer complaints up the chain of command to be ignored. Despite this, the yards build some of the finest ships in the archipelago, technologically advanced vessels of superior engineering and often titanic size. Those magnates who can afford to do so bring their needs and plans to Kemplin, and he makes them a reality at startling cost. Kemplin's own fleet, a sombre black and grey, can usually be found deployed across the archipelago, securing the resources that he needs. And when not in his soundproofed library aboard his flagship, Mr. Kemplin is found in the Cloud Yards, overseeing his empire. Kemplin is very much the Elon Musk to Merst's Jeff Bezos, desperate to be revered and respected, but haughty and pathetic enough that he resorts to force and subterfuge to ensure that he is treated that way. You can feel this influence in the next excerpt, taken from a columnist on Thunderhead. It reads like a puff piece that could have been taken from the Daily Telegraph. The Kemplin Library is a learning establishment like no other, with scores of students arriving each day, with scores more graduating from their subjects and heading out into the archipelago to take up positions as surgeons, engineers, salt brewers and teachers in their own right. And at the heart of it all sits Mr. Kemplin, writing his books, crafting his curriculums, instructing his librarians. Can it really be said that he is simply an observer in all that passes in the archipelago? Or is he in fact an enabler? Is he, in truth, of the great driving forces which have propelled us on our journey into the most perilous unknown of all? The future as imagined by men of great influence, and that imagining's volatile contact with reality. Yikes, that is some paid for content if ever I've heard any. Kemplen himself writes in a similar way, diminishing the great man theory, all whilst making sure that this is exactly the tone used to talk about him in this passage from another of his books. There is a theory among histories written in the archipelago that they call the idea of the great individual. It is a suggestion that there are men who by their work, by their person, are the hinges and fulcrums of history. Perhaps this is true. There are those among my peers who would ascribe to this theory and even place themselves in its category. I have even felt its gravity myself. Certainly the breadth of sources written by Kemplen and his recurring presence throughout the book indicates a desire to be involved in every conversation, to be revered and respected. Kemplen's repetitive attempts to position himself as an expert on all things and to restrict the access of information to others leads to articles like this, where he attempts to demonize and ridicule those that would seek to democratize information and weaken his stranglehold on the archipelago. I've heard these people talk. They want something poisonous and uncontrolled, a knowledge which might put to an end the salt reactor, perhaps even an end to the need for mines, certainly an end to our way of life altogether. Their supercilious philosophy, they tell, is to invent and publish a knowledge of that hidden world within materials which is accessible to anyone at all. They map the gravity fields which keep the stones afloat. These charts will put traditional cartographers out of business. More abrupt still, their equipment, they have said, is not for sale. Not at any price. Nor their recordings. They intend to release their findings for just anyone to exploit. Gravimetricians, a grand name for these conspirators. This is why I need you to find that gravimetric surveyor out of Thunderhead and disable it. If the vessel vanishes entirely, no one will look for it. I can guarantee you that much. That is the sound of a man that seeks to preserve the status quo, since it suits him just fine. Whether the Merst family or Kemplen is the biggest threat to humanity in Mileships is open to debate, but ultimately both share a desire to maintain the current economic system and to gain as much control over it as possible, with little care for those who toil beneath them or that die in the service of their greed and ambition. The third and final of the recurring characters that I wanted to highlight is Huna Linteg and their vessel, the Remora. In comparison to Merst and Kemplen, Linteg is a humble independent captain with their small and ramshackle boat, the Remora. Through a number of different journal entries and articles, we follow the last days of the Remora as Linteg finishes up their final few voyages, sharing the wisdom and experience of someone that has operated in the shadow of the giant ships, doing small-scale and poorly paid jobs whilst trying to avoid being caught in the undertow of the rich and powerful. I would like to share the majority of the first journal entry by Linteg as I feel it illustrates nicely everything that makes him such a fun little protagonist throughout this book. We never looked for trouble. I'd like that as an epitaph somewhere, carved in funerary stone and hurled into the sea. I'd like a sky burial. I've always liked Shiandao. It hangs on half a dozen stones, it brings back good memories of the archipelago of my youth. The place seemed brighter then. The Remora still had some parts that were new. Stations like this one are for stopping at a while. They are for crossing paths. The big cloud stacks and shipyards are all business. People have a procedure there, a list they need to get checked off. Straight off the boat and into town, to drink, to sign papers, to find someone, to go home. It's all about the obligations, the burdens. But a place like this? No. It's just a transit station. A pause on the journey, and we will meet again with other freelancers who will tell us of other freelancers and the gossip and story which filters down from on high. The big ships, the skyborn and their palaces. And we have some stories of our own to share too, because it has been many months since we came this way. The Remora has run a long course and it felt like the end of a chapter. A chapter we need to explain to ourselves as we explain it to others. Unlike the large-scale views of Merst and Kemplen, Linteg talks of life among the stones and of the ordinary people. They care about their crew and about just keeping going, heading towards the next stop on the journey, looking one waypoint ahead. Ships like the Remora are cobbled together with random parts and kept just about operational, as they are unable to afford a brand new or perfectly fitting part, let alone a new ship. And whilst this is a largely economic reality, it also makes it part of a wider philosophical tapestry for many of the independent crews of the archipelago. Recombination. The art of rebuilding ships, putting together parts, building rigs, barges and pickets that will fly for another decade on the shells of the old. This journal complains that the age of the Mileship is over, and that the manufacturing that made it possible has wearied and died, but we all know that we must save the stones. And that means human ingenuity is the solution. And is that ingenuity found in this name or that, this Merst or that Kemplen? No. It is found in the crews and the engineers and the salt renders, whose knowledge and invention is what allowed our culture to live in the sky at all. Readers, do not lament the Mileship or listen to the platitudes of the industry men. No. Instead, rest happy in the quiet action of the independent crews, for it is by their labour that the will shall continue to live amongst the stones and continue to make a life in the clouds. The Remora is our window into that world, reminiscent of the Terry Pratchett criticism that it is more expensive to live as a poor person than a rich one, as expressed by his character Vimes in Men-at-Arms. The reason that the rich were so rich, Vimes reasoned, was because they managed to spend less money. The thing was that good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that would still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while the poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. Linteg would never earn enough to replace the Remora, or even to get correctly fitting new parts, and so each job was just enough to patch the latest problem and head on to the next one. Life for ordinary people is like that. We all look to our next paycheck to fix the latest issue, the misbehaving boiler, the car making weird noises, the smashed phone. Linteg and the crew of the Remora are all of us. Linteg and the Remora continue to travel and mind their own business throughout the book, avoiding problematic conflicts with more predatory ships, performing small acts of camaraderie and kindness, and generally practicing a philosophy of treat others as you wish to be treated. The final entry of Huna Linteg's journal reveals that she is retired and made a home for herself on a stone of their own, using the Remora as a functional building, but putting an end to their travels permanently. I cannot foresee anything, and I do not wish to. I can live in one place now, and so I can also live in the present. The Remora, like myself, has now found a use in stillness. Together we saw sights that very much made a life, and that ship had seen much more and many other captains before I helmed her. There can be no regret in such an ending, because it is the finite length of the journey that makes it worth undertaking. We survived knife fights in the underflows, we bartered for eels down in the stilt marshes, we saw weddings and funerals, we saw people fall into the clouds and vanish from the world. I dream of those times. The dreams come stronger now. Today I had a letter from the map boy, cartographer I should say, who said he will one day find me out here. I hope he does. In the meantime, I have cabbages growing and livestock on the slope, and that, I finally realise, is enough. It is refreshing to see a genuine counter-narrative to the great person theory that is referred to by Kemplen, and to see this fascinating world through the eyes of someone describing what they have seen, as opposed to what they want us to hear, and to understand a little bit more of what life is like in the shadow of the rich and powerful. Let us move on now to talking about some of the themes that come up in Mileships. The world of Mileships shares a significant overlap with our own, in that it is experiencing something of a decline of the established civilization. I know, right? One thing that seems to be nearly universally acknowledged by all the different viewpoints we encounter is that things are changing, even if some see it as a net positive and others a negative. For example, the people who run this city in the stones often talk about how long it can last, and few of them suppose it is forever. Thunderhead is one of the great townships, but there is something approaching a consensus that its days are numbered, along with many of the other great floating ships and towns. Kemplen, though largely an optimistic sort, has a similar feeling about the townships, though perhaps more due to the fact that Labour has a better chance to organise in these large and densely populated urban centres. The township we saw was Bavin, Maine, and a composting derelict it was. The townships are a failing symbol of what the Mileships tried to be, an evolutionary dead end that I think we can all agree was unsustainable even in the last century, when little mind was paid to how we mined or what salt we burned. The growing sense that Mileships are increasingly part of the world's past and not its future is echoed here too. I am not one of these gloom folk. I do not believe in the accounts which reason that the stones must someday fall from the sky, but I do believe there to be a tipping point in which the ships we built must finish. We already see it. There are wrecks on the plains and in the highlands that there is not even a record of. I've seen them, and because I don't wish to join them, I won't be adding myself to the crew of one of those famous names. Now, not all in agreement with the age of Mileships coming to an inevitable end, of course, as documented here by author Roshua Moss-Werton, though there is something of the "we can invent ourselves out of climate change" to this sentiment, which feels more hopeful than expectant. As for that assertion that the golden age of the Mileships is over, few writes are in agreement. "A new age is upon us," they explained to me, their tea spilling and becoming one with the clouds below. "Those boffins will see to it, they always find a way." This optimism is shared in this piece by Jarrell Eckfirth, who perhaps can see the dissolution of the ruling powers and the crumbling of the old ways of living, and a more egalitarian existence being possible if society begins being carried by smaller, less privileged vessels. Readers, do not lament the Mileship or listen to the platitudes of the industry men. No, instead rest happy in the quiet action of the independent crews, for it is by their labour that the will shall continue to live among the stones and continue to make a life in the clouds. The decline of the Mileship, whether real or rhetorical, acts as an interesting comparison to our economic stagnation in the UK, a post-colonial empire that is rotting from the inside, whilst billionaires and historically wealthy families pick over our remains, or whilst ordinary people struggle to survive and seek to just make it from one week to the next. It also acts as a metaphor for climate change, the growing sense of an inevitable doom that everyone seems to be aware of, but few in power seem willing to acknowledge. Some problems are too big for the human psyche to comprehend, especially when we see such a small slice of life at any one time, and Mileships gives us a chance to collect those small slices in an attempt to understand the vastness of the world from the bottom up. We don't know much about the causes of the environmental changes in Mileships. We are just told that it happened. There doesn't seem to be any acknowledgement of it having been the result of humanity's actions, so we take it on faith that it is a random event of some kind. That being said, there are several mentions of resource scarcity, particularly with regards to the materials needed to keep the Mileships above and not part of the marshes, such as this from Aldous Kemplen. Our journals pointed to the rust, the dwindling, exhausted salt mines. This, they argued, was a sign of a great decline, even a collapse. Things could not go on. Change was inevitable, inexorable, and this age would give way to another. Paired with the talk of the finite resources needed to live in the archipelago, there is also talk of relentless consumption, and of how the greed and desperation of some has led to a physical impact to their planet, as per this. The fallen landscape of the McKinley Basin is a sign of where men mined too greedily and the once weightless stones fell from the sky. Stripped of salts and antimetals, a massive ebb of stones lost buoyancy and plunged into the murk of the silt plains some 5 decades past. Few stones fall now. McKinley is a mark of shame for many, a point at which the project of living in the sky went too far. Is life in the archipelago worth the trouble and cost, one wonders? Or is it the equivalent of the American dream, an aspiration that is unachievable by the majority and unsustainable in the extreme? Huna Linteg seems to reject this worldview, retiring their vessel and committing to farming on one of the smaller stones. And this rejection of industry and economic activity that enriches the capitalist reflects a growing resistance to the conventional lifestyle of the Mileships, as represented by the words of Nan Harrick. When industry has done its work and moved on to blacken other skies, nature returns to the stones. Where now waterfalls mist the cold air and pines grow in dark stands against the pale moss grounds, a certain solace might be found. This place is riven with ghosts, but they do not begrudge a visitor and walk alongside them unseen in the green shadow of the stones. The cry of a bird, the cold scent of growth, a chime of rocks and the creak of an old hauler overhead, just passing through, all on our way to that final birth. There is a conflict central to Mileships that rumbles underneath all of the razzle-dazzle and headlines, and it regards the struggle for control of the means of production. We have the Merst family with their huge fleets and their cutthroat approach to business. We have Kemplin and his shipbuilding yards and his huge propaganda presence. We also have numerous other referenced capitalist entities like the Penton family, the Morven Cruick clan, or the independent shipyards at Flagstone that are all fighting for their slice of the archipelago. All of these great institutions require labour to function, and like all capitalist enterprises, they want to maximise profit. And what is the easiest way to do that? It's to squeeze labour. More hours, lower wages, worse working conditions, etc. Labour, if it has any sense, defends itself via unionisation, strikes, pickets and organised resistance, and there are quite a number of references to this during the course of the book, starting with this from the Thunderhead Journal. Union representative called B. Alberclaim said that his side had been working diligently to relieve tensions and that Mr. Merst's immediate escalations had made a tense situation worse. We do not expect a man like Edwin Merst to understand the plight of the labourers in his yards, since he is so rarely present in them, said Alberclaim. Merst strikebreaker teams have reportedly been seen equipping boarding batons and other weighted non-lethal equipment to remove Union members from contested buildings and anchored vessels in the Flagstone area. One man is reported to have been injured with a harpoon. Despite the heavy-handed efforts of Merst, Kemplin and the other magnates, there are several references made to a growing labour resistance, and there is an excerpt shared from a speech given by Councillor Gifford Golwener at a mutiny tribunal that hits home the rising sentiment of the working class in the archipelago. We cannot divest an individual's responsibility on the basis of their wealth. The derangement we have allowed to propagate that vast wealth comes with diminished responsibility is one that poisons our minds and pollutes our politics. This irrational and baseless attitude has been conjured wholly by the dissemblings and mendacity of Edwin Merst and all those who see skyborne ownership of the archipelago as the natural order of things. Merst absolutely bears culpability for events surrounding this new mutiny, just as all his class and echelon do for the events of the first. Disorder in the archipelago is not down to greed and indiscipline among crews, it is a direct consequence of cruelty, untruth and manipulation by men whose resources are unimaginable to the average family anywhere in the sky. This growing resentment of the moneyed families and an increasing willingness to stand up against them has already seen some improvements in worker relations, as per this piece from Ruyen Spartlow. The best known unions and workers' organisations merged 2 decades past and formed the Honourable United Table of Teamsters, Docksters and Pilots. Conditions improved for these workers despite Kemplin and Merst's best efforts at strike breaking. Fatalities among dockers have fallen by half. Despite these gains, however, the violence continues to escalate as capital fights to maintain its dominance in the archipelago, as illustrated by journalist Gretna Yore. Witnesses have told the Thunderhead Journal that Merst repo men employed undue force in the repossession of the mid-ranged picket Pentelwaines 5. Speaking on condition of anonymity, a dock labourer on a neutral vessel said they witnessed Merst men using weighted batons and boarding rods to subdue the crew. One of those folks did not get up again, reported the eyewitness. We have not yet been able to reach the crew of the vessel for comment, and their whereabouts are unknown at the present time. Indeed, the humble successes of the union movement so far have driven a colder and darker approach by Merst, and the situation looks set to escalate even further, as seen in this quote from one of their own employees. Harvest is the optimal time to move on these unincorporated settlements. It may seem counterintuitive because they will see the ships a mile off, but you want them out in the fields when the ships arrive. Spread out, collecting their produce, they will not have time to return to their buildings where they might organise or resist our arrival. In fact, I would go as far as to say they want to see us coming for purposes of intimidation. Psychology, they call it. There's a reason we paint these ships black. The battle for workers' rights and for a fair share of the spoils of industry looks set to continue, and I would be interested in the follow-up to that one day, Mr. McQue. Mileships spends much of its time talking about the largely traditional and capitalism-friendly elements of Archipelago, and talks a little of the vestiges of traditional democracy, usually localised to the city-states large enough to support such bureaucracy. These parts are familiar to us, as they largely reflect the lived experience of much of the world. Rich guys paying poor guys less than they produce, and living off of the theft of that value. However, we do hear the odd reference to places in the Mileships world that do things just a little differently. For example, we hear a little talk of anarchist settlements, as mentioned in the Sultan sayings of Nanharik. Imagine then that there was a place where all people who settled upon a stone were responsible for the conduct of those around them, and where they would say that if one man stole, then all the community stole, and that every person was responsible for the return of even one loaf of bread. Imagine then that there was a house upon the stones where all of a family would contribute to its upkeep and therefore be entitled to ownership of the whole, to a total custodianship of that house and not a mean and private share. And there is such a place, of course. It is all the stones beyond the widest gulfs, those stones that affiliate such that they are spoken of as the witch rock dependencies, but who themselves understand that they are the true state that man should be found in, communal and obligated as equals, and not collared by a structure such as that great society found in the central stones. In that passage, we have talk of shared responsibility, communal policing, public ownership, and an understanding of egalitarian values. We also see an excerpt from the manifesto of the Good People of the Crow that talks in a similar fashion. We, the Good People of the Crow, work the stones by our own effort and expect nothing of any other except that they contribute to the effort of the whole. None shall say they own these lands in the sky, and only partake in them as one partakes in a shared meal. Each brings their own to the table. The Good People of the Crow will respect the migrations of the sky, be they person or animal, and always know that it is by what we may work from this place that we continue to live and to raise families in a peaceful time. Resistance to subjugation shall be our religion, and no company ships might say that we owe them any rent or service of any kind, for that is not our way. The Good People of the Crow talk of owning the product of their labour, of rejecting the private ownership of land and territory, of rejecting any form of discrimination. They also describe themselves as militant and prepared to actively resist subjugation, so bonus points for that. The other main bastion of egalitarian living seems to be the silkwalkers living on the surface, who utilise a shared ownership model for their production facilities. Putting money into a smokehouse syndicate is the process by which a youth becomes an elder amongst the marshfolk. If you do not have a stake in the great business, the rationale runs, then how can you be said to be really settled? Indeed, although the notion is unspoken, the tradition of a smokehouse stake is often implicit with the idea that an individual will stay and will not use their cash to buy their way into the archipelago overhead. Only those who keep their feet on the ground are allowed to maintain a smokehouse holding. This logic extends to a number of enterprises in this region, which stress shared ownership and cooperation, a philosophy of property which has not extended to many areas of the archipelago, with the exception of the group responsibility laws seen in some of the remote regions of the Witch Rock dependencies. Finally, I wanted to highlight this single entry which mentioned The Trust, an attempt to create a central and impartial fact-checker and news service. The concept is intriguing, especially in a world where communication is seemingly word of mouth, notes sent by bird, or the occasional telegram. There is, of course, one thing more valuable and dangerous than the buoyant materials of the archipelago, and that is the truth. The Trust, created by Oxton Bradley and Heather Wirrell, has been charged with producing as much truth as possible and making it available to anyone, for a fee. The Bradley Wirrell Independent Office for Measurement and Control has eyes and theodolites everywhere, and their constant task is to provide an accurate picture of the world in numbers. They take note if your vessel has changed name or configuration. They wait at the docks to provide an independent note of comings and goings, cargoes and crews. In a world where we rely on private companies for our news and analysis, as well as fully captured public news broadcasters like the BBC, there is something very appealing about having a source that was just there to measure and report the facts. Though of course we must also acknowledge that they do then sell this information on, suggesting a risk of bias in the name of profit. Still though, I thought it an interesting addition to the world building of Mileships, and a shrewd observation from Ian McQue and Jim Rossignol to include such an organisation in a time where so much knowledge has been lost or is simply in flux. Anyway, we have talked of the world, its characters and its themes. Let's talk about the book itself, shall we? First up, Mileships is a fantastic book of extremely high quality in terms of the artwork, the world building and of the actual book itself. At 190 odd pages, this is a thick old narrative art book, but the binding and paper quality means that it should be one that lasts. The choices made to do this as a hardback with a high paper quality really sell that this is a labour of love as opposed to some other art books I have, and it complements the care that has gone into every aspect of this book. Using excerpts from fictional articles, journals and books as a means of framing the artworks inside of a wider world is a really nice idea and provides an organic feel to the information you are given. Kemplen, Linteg and some of the authors we encounter have very different styles and characters to their writing, and it adds so much richness and depth to an already compelling world. The inclusion of the sketches as well as the main artworks could be seen as a cheap filler option in some books, but the sketches are in fact distinct in content from the main artworks and are all labelled up in order to provide even more depth to the world. It starts to feel as if McQue was sat in a skydock just drawing the ships as they came in. It's a lot of fun. If you can't tell already, this is easily one of my favourite narrative art books, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It covers politics, mythology, sociology, economics and the development of culture, and as with everything I include in my videos, there are lessons to be learned along the way. You can certainly do worse than to seek a copy out for yourselves, that's for sure. Thank you for watching this video on Ian McQue's Mileships, a journey through the skies on a sketchy little boat held together with tape and wishes. If you have enjoyed your time with me, please give this video a like and drop a comment on your thoughts, ideas or ruminations. It all helps me get the video out to more people. Thanks also goes out to Mrs. InsideLeft for their patient support along with the setup and scripting, to Adventsong Leech Comfort for the use of their music, and to the We Create Together crew for their constant motivation and advice. Thanks again for watching. Be safe, be brave and be kind, comrades. I shall see you soon. Bye for now.